Nostalgia is an emotional cheat code. If you can pinpoint something people are nostalgic for and wrap it into your own work, it can be the ultimate shortcut to emotional resonance. I mean, this whole video could just be me spouting off random old things for 15 minutes, and even if it hardly makes sense, you'll still have some kind of positive association with it. Remember Kerbal Space Program? Remember Captain Underpants? Remember Dynamite by Tayo Cruz? Remember Silly Bandz? There was like a 2-year period where society was run on a purely silly band-based economy. But there's a way to be cheap about nostalgia, and then there's a way to be more. Every so often, a piece of media will come out that feels like it exists in stasis. Even if you're aware of it before its release and you experience it when it's brand new, it somehow ripples through time and feels like it's always been there. It's this impossible balancing act between the past, present, and future where you're evoking nostalgia but not being overtaken by it. And that's really not an easy thing to pull off, considering every time you try to leverage nostalgia, you are making direct comparisons. And not just any comparisons, but comparisons to things that we have love for and view through rose-tinted glasses. As much as nostalgia is a cheat code, relying on it typically means that you're accepting that your work will partially live in the shadow of what's come before. And yet, some of the most iconic games, especially indie games of the last decade, have managed to overcome that shadow. Instead of being compared to other games are compared to them. Because they don't feel like games from the past or the present or even the future. Instead, they're all of those at once. They are genuinely timeless. And I think that comes from viewing the past as more than just an aesthetic, and their inspirations as more than just their final product. Instead of just taking ideas from the team's favorite childhood games, whether it's stylistic or mechanical, they looked into why certain decisions were made, and why they had such distinct and striking looks apart from just lower pixel counts. These games aren't just retro-themed, they're retro-literate, and so it's unsurprising that an attribute a lot of them share is simplicity. If you've spent more than 0.2 seconds engaging in online discourse about character design, you've probably heard this phrase pop up. A good character design is one which can be identified by its silhouette alone. For example, you look at this silhouette and you're like, well, that's just a generic male character. That could literally be anyone. But then you look at this silhouette and you're like, oh, that's Nathan Drake from Uncharted. Of course. What do you think, I'm stupid? Of course, the only issue is that other character was also Nathan Drake from Uncharted. The issue I have with the silhouette rule is that it never actually addresses the question, which silhouette? Because especially for more detailed, realistic characters, it really depends on what position you're putting them in. Is it like key art or something that comes from an iconic scene, or just a random snapshot of them on the street? If that affects things so drastically, does this really measure the effectiveness of character design, or just people's memory of marketing material? And obviously there are some characters, especially simpler ones, that can be identified no matter what position they're in. And the broader idea of the silhouette rule is that there should at least be some silhouettes of the character that are easily identifiable. But even then, it's not a hard and fast rule. And I think a better rule, especially for retro-themed games, is a good character design is one that can be identified after stripping away all of its detail. The limitations of old consoles forced artists to express personality, emotions, and distinct characteristics with extremely limited real estate, which meant not a single pixel could be wasted. It was less about distinct silhouettes, at least for in-game models, and more about colors and one or two standout features. And the same can be said about the best modern games that emulate 80s and 90s game aesthetics. In Celeste, for example, Madeline's hair is essentially one flat color and some shadows, but it's so identifiable because not only is it a large part of her character model, just like physically takes up a lot of space, the mountain you're climbing has very strong winds and you're constantly moving through the air quickly, so it's typically flowing behind you and accenting that sense of momentum the game has. It really makes her stand out as a character in a way where you could never confuse her with someone else. Even for games that don't emulate old school pixel art like Hollow Knight, you can see how important simplicity still is to the character models. I can continuously make the knight's design more and more abstract, and it's still recognizable even at a glance. I can ask you which video game character this is, is this image of literally two shapes and a single color, and you can probably tell it's Cuphead. These visual motifs are so strong that they can be turned into much smaller sprites that can fit on something like the NES and not lose their sense of identity, even if that's no longer a restraint that the devs need to adhere to. And this also goes past just aesthetics. Mechanically, a lot of these games also cut down on unnecessary flourishes. Hollow Knight is probably the most mechanically complex out of all of the games on here, along with Tunic, and even its highly praised combat system is fairly stripped back. It's mostly just directional swings and dashes, but if a game with combat that's mostly directional swings and dashes feels snappy and responsive in 2017, it'll probably still feel pretty great in like 2040. And I should probably clarify here that I'm not passing judgment on what the best way to design a game is. I don't think simplicity is a requirement to making a good game. I mean, look at Split Fiction and its maximalist approach to mechanics and level design. That game is incredible because it feels like something that can only be made at this evolved stage of game development. But simplicity is a more universal language. Simple concepts that are cleanly executed can live forever. They don't get aged out over time. That's why you can still play Pac-Man and Tetris and the original Mario games, but then playing some of the best and most advanced games of even just 15 years ago can sometimes feel obtuse and outdated. And obviously Hollow Knight isn't quite as simple as something like Pac-Man, but with a few tweaks you could have created something like Hollow Knight in the SNES era. So even though it just came out 3 years ago, it's preemptively established itself as something that can stand the test of Did you say 8 years ago? This idea of simplicity in both aesthetics and design for a modern game is maybe best represented by Shovel Knight, which is, in my opinion, the ultimate retro-themed game. Character-wise, it does an incredible job at creating a mascot that's very identifiable off of just a couple of strong features. In this case, the horns and the shovel. I mean, this character is so unique, you don't even need to show him. You just need to show his weapon and people will instantly know who it is. This game also manages to take a single strong idea, this downward thrust mechanic that was inspired by Zelda 2, and use that as the core of all of the game's encounters, bosses, levels, and challenges. It's the embodiment of simplicity, but more than that, it understands the overall importance of restraint and when to break it. Shovel Knight feels like it was designed specifically to be a rose-tinted version of an old 8-bit NES game. It's almost as if it exists in this alternate dimension where NES development never stopped, where games could benefit from modern design lessons, but the underlying tech remained the same apart from some subtle but substantial upgrades. And it feels that way because that's literally how it was designed, and I stole that from an article the team posted. This article, Breaking the NES, is actually the basis for multiple videos on YouTube about Shovel Knight, and the reason that it's such an interesting read and has spawned so many think pieces is because it gives insight to not only how the team painstakingly tried to emulate the most minute visual quirks and constraints of the NES, but also when they decided to say, you know what, it just makes no sense to stick by this. And at a glance, it seems almost random what they decided to emulate and what they didn't. For example, they stuck pretty closely to the extremely limited NES color palette. They treated the HUD as if it was painted onto the background since the NES only had one layer that the background and UI had to share. And my favorite easily missable detail is tied to the boss fights. Right now I'm showing you some of the bosses in the original campaign, and nothing looks strange or out of place when you move from one to another, right? Now look at this boss, and this boss, and this boss. Do you notice something a little bit different about them? All of these bosses with smaller sprites have detailed backgrounds, but the second the boss sprites get much larger, they're accompanied by black or near black backgrounds. And this is because on the NES, the only way to implement larger sprites was to use the background layer, because the system's sprite hardware couldn't really handle large objects. That's why every time you encountered a large enemy in an NES game, it would seem like there was no background. In the words of the article, the boss is the background. And the team wanted to emulate the consequences of that constraint in Shovel Knight, even though they obviously didn't have the same sprite limitations. But despite paying such close attention to some of these restrictions, there were some moments where the dev team decided to throw all of this out the window. The physical size of the game blew actual NES games out of the water. There were actually 4 special colors added to the color palette for various reasons, and the biggest break from the NES was the addition of parallax effects, where the background is made up of multiple scrolling layers to give the illusion of depth, something that didn't really exist until the SNES. And this is so interesting to me because multiple major design constraints that I just mentioned came from the fact that the NES did not have more than one background layer. And then they suddenly decided that their biggest departure was going to be adding way more background layers than the NES. It seems completely counterintuitive, and in this article they attempt to justify their decision by claiming that in their fictional timeline where games were still being developed for the NES 20 years later, parallax scrolling would have been a part of the natural evolution of these games, which is fair. But that still doesn't explain why these other restrictions were still kept. The answer to how exactly they determined where to draw the line with this game is completely elusive if you're looking for an actual scientific, calculated reason for it. Because there is no actual scientific, calculated reason for it. It's completely up to artistic freedom. Where the team decided to meet the NES where it was, and where they decided to stretch it in ways that added that rose-tinted flair, seems completely arbitrary because it is completely arbitrary. Just like a few examples I mentioned in my D-Makes video from last year. Sometimes the devs behind these games, who are specifically solely recreating modern titles for retro hardware as accurately as possible, decide to completely ignore certain restrictions because the final output would be better off for it. And ultimately, there's no real substitute for an artist's gut feeling about where to break their own rules. Cuphead is another example of a game that seemingly refused to make any concessions in its visuals. This team drew thousands on thousands of images to authentically recreate the rubber hose style of the 30s and 40s, complete with the small visual hitches, scratches, and grainy footage that came with it. But then when it came to coloring everything, they used Photoshop, even though I'm pretty sure Walt Disney didn't have a Creative Cloud subscription. Why? Why would a team so dedicated to authenticity make a move that is so distinctly modern? Because they felt like it. The understanding of where to stray from your original creative intentions or restrictions can't really be taught. You have to have a level of trust in your intuition to know where to draw the line. In fact, part of what makes these games so unique from one another, even though they have so many overlapping inspirations, is that their intuition takes them to drastically different places. For example, like I mentioned, Yacht Club Games didn't really care about the physical size of Shovel Knight meeting the restrictions of older games, but Billy Basso did care about it when he was making Animal. This game is less than 38 megabytes on PC. That's megabytes with an M. That is 4 times smaller than the audio recording for this video alone. And it was able to pull that off through this one super quick and easy technique called creating an entire game engine from scratch. But despite this Herculean effort to package a game like this into such a small space, it doesn't even try to match Shovel Knight in its authenticity to old school visuals and design quirks, because that wasn't the type of nostalgia Billy wanted to evoke with this game. Instead, he wanted to capture something much more open-ended. The feeling of older games. Game consumption was incredibly different in the 80s and 90s. With less subscription services, relatively more expensive prices, fewer overall games on the market, and access to storefronts being much more limited, people were typically more selective with their purchases, and games that could take 10 hours to beat front to back were somehow supposed to last players months. And this influenced a lot of design decisions in these older games. Difficulty for one, but also density. Despite these games being a lot more compact than they are today, they were often hiding a lot of things behind the scenes. Easter eggs, different routes through levels, hidden areas off the beaten path, weird and clunky shortcuts. This was the norm for the best games of at least a sliver of time. And Animal Well feels like the product of someone who wanted to convey that overall sense of discovery and malleable world design, rather than perfectly mimic the exact aesthetics and rules of older titles. Because let's be honest, this game looks way too goddamn good to compare to an actual SNES game. I mean, there are some good looking games on that console, but come on. The lighting here is jaw-dropping. It's got this neon, almost kaleidoscopic look. The shadows cast in the background give this illusion of depth despite how truly flat and 2D the levels are. The ghostly hues of characters that warp around add to the strangeness of this world, and maybe my favorite thing about the whole experience is this flare effect. The way it sizzles and flickers, the accompanying sound effects, you can practically feel it burning a hole directly into your screen. There is no game from the era that Animal Well is trying to emulate that is even in the same stratosphere stylistically, but it still has the heart of a retro game. It lets the player discover strange routes, slip through parts of the map that seem solid, and find secrets that occasionally break the fourth wall. It's a 10-hour game that you can still learn new things about 80 hours in. It's a game where every path you take seems like the right one, and taking the wrong path is rewarded. And most of all, it's an independent statement. The second this game came out, it felt like it crystallized and existed immediately in the state it will likely be in forever. Long-term engagement with Animal Well seems like it'll come purely from replay value and uncovering new layers of the experience as the months and undoubtedly years go on. There's a real beauty in games where you feel like the creator is speaking directly to you through their art, and by engaging with that art, you're almost having a conversation. It's incredibly rare in the internet era where all conversations are spoken directly, all the time, endlessly, for no reason. But being able to capture that non-traditional form of communication is what Animal Well does so perfectly. Tunic's Abstract Manual is another example of this. The game is speaking to you through the environment, through this coded language, through on-screen hints, and you need to be willing to meet it halfway in order to get the most out of it. The fact that these games can serve as such definitive artistic statements and feel so separate from the creators that made them is why somebody playing these games 10, 20, 30 years from now will have the exact same experience as somebody playing them today. And if they're able to stand on foundations from the 80s, hell, sometimes foundations from the 30s, what's another few decades gonna do? Especially if in the midst of anchoring themselves in something old, they can manage to find something new. Celeste's air dash is not a new mechanic by itself. We've seen versions of this before, but never in this tight, multi-route format that's tied together with a simple but touching story. Like I said, Shovel Knight's main move came from an old Zelda game, but we've never seen something like that used as a central mechanic that informs the rest of the game's design before. Cuphead and Mugman's character design is very clearly derived from both Disney mascots like Mickey Mouse and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and the anatomical design of background characters from those cartoons, but then it's paired with this strange lore and themes of gambling and hell in the midst of this cheery adventure full of energetic big band music, and it creates something completely unique. There are even some recent games that feel like they do something so new with something so old that it's shocking that it hasn't been done before. Downwell could have easily been a classic early arcade game, and I can't believe this hadn't been thought of before. Vampire Survivors feels like what the passive game genre should have been for like 20 years now. Balatro is a new, novel, essential playing card game. How do you even pull that off? They've been making playing card games since the 9th century. You can't just make a new classic in 2024. What the hell's wrong with you? People love complaining that video games are in a creative rut and are lacking the innovation of years past because everything is derived from what came before. But meanwhile, even solo devs are shaking up the entire landscape of video games by innovating on those old ideas and creating art that could potentially, through influence or sustained engagement, outlive the people watching this video. I mean, Pac-Man's still being played after like 50 years with no signs of slowing down. Why can't Balatro last 100 years? It's so interesting to me to see how many of the most celebrated games of the last decade, especially in the indie scene, which many people would consider the creative epicenter of modern games, are heavily rooted and sometimes downright beholden to the themes, aesthetics, and structure of older titles. Because it seems oxymoronic. How can they be unique when they're so obviously evoking nostalgia? But creativity isn't about doing something that's never been done before. It's about approaching something familiar in a way that nobody else has. Which is why, as hard as I tried, it's impossible to actually pin down a formula for this. Everything I've mentioned in this video, simplicity, constraints, breaking constraints, capturing the feeling, communicating through art, and finding something old in something new, it's all good to understand, but it's not exactly a rule book. So much of this is open-ended and can be interpreted in 100 different ways. And maybe the only real constant I can actually find between all the games I mentioned in this video is that they refuse to approach things in the same way as one another. I'll say it again, there's no real substitution for an artist's gut feeling. That's where you get true creative expression regardless of how much of an idea is derived from the work that came before it. And I think that's important to keep in mind at a time when there's been a lot of talk about originality, especially as new technology starts to threaten creative fields. It is possible to wear your influences on your sleeve and evoke nostalgia while still being influential in your own right, but only by making offbeat human choices. Which is why even if machines can eventually perfectly remix existing ideas into something totally capable and coherent, they can never produce something that's truly timeless. I hope you all enjoy the video. If you want to see more of me, by the way, I have a podcast now. It's called Cleric. It's co-hosted by my friend and fellow content creator Landon Hansen, who you might remember from the Arkham Asylum video. Episode 0 is up now. It's about reviving dead game franchises, and the official episode 1 should be up about a week from now. We're super excited about this project. You can follow Cleric on YouTube and other podcast platforms. It'll all be linked in the description. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.